the word of the Lord and see how they are. Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul thought it best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him, and they sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas, and they departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. May God bless us as we seek to live in His Word together. When I was a teenager, First Baptist Church, Lyford, where I grew up, was one of the more happening churches in the Rio Grande Valley. We were a small church in a small community, but we were experiencing rapid growth. We went on trips as a youth group. We hosted valley-wide youth conferences. We held fifth quarters that were probably the best attended social events in our whole community. People would turn out in droves for those gatherings. The church was going places, and we were kind of busting at the seams. We would have fellowships, and there just wasn't enough room in our facility to house all the people that were being reached. My freshman year of college, the church began moving forward with a building project, quickly became mired in a bitter dispute about what to build, where to build it, how to build it, and how much to spend on whatever it was that they were going to build. And I think most of the participants in that bitter dispute would now say that there was fault to go around, but at the time there was very little understanding. Battle lines were drawn, and the conflict was quite vicious. A lot of people were hurt. The lid finally blew off the conflict on a Sunday morning in a pretty ugly scene, and shortly thereafter the pastor and several of the members for the congregation left the church altogether. And whenever I think back to that terrible time of painful conflict as the fellowship of my youth was fractured so drastically, my heart grows very heavy. I think about the pastor who performed our wedding, who was forced to leave the congregation. I think about the friends who were wounded in that fight and the opportunities that were sacrificed through sins of pride, and I get a little emotional even to this day. It is heart-wrenching to think about people who were caught in the crossfire of that great conflict, people who left the church and probably still aren't worshiping or serving anywhere even today. Yet somehow God blessed through that painful conflict. I learned a lot from it. My dad now serves as a pastor at First Baptist Church of Santa Rosa, and other ripple effects have shown how God really does cause all things to work together for good for those who love Him, for those who are called according to His purpose. Still, I wouldn't wish that terrible time of conflict upon anyone, upon any congregation. Intense church conflict produces deep, painful feelings of disappointment, grief, loss, and rejection. And if you've ever lived through that kind of church split, I think you would agree that feels something like a divorce or a death. It's a very grief-filled experience. Today's text in this ongoing story of the good news of Christ's church is set against the backdrop of those kinds of hurtful emotions. Paul says to Barnabas, let's go back and visit these churches that we've planted along the way on our last journey. Barnabas thinks it's a great idea. These two men have been a dynamic duo of preaching and teaching in Antioch. They have been a great missionary team traveling across the globe with the gospel. They stood toe-to-toe against the Judaizers at the Ultimate Family Council that we read about last week, and they turned back the tide against those who would try to add restrictions to the gospel of grace. Now would be a great time to take that message of grace and encourage the churches with it, and maybe take that grace into places that had never heard it before. Plant new churches along the way. So Barnabas said, I think that's a great idea. Let me just call John Mark. We'll set up a meeting for the three of us. We'll coordinate our calendars, and we'll come up with a really good itinerary for the trip. We imagine Paul kind of scratching the back of his neck, feeling a little uncomfortable and saying, Barney, I just don't think that's a great idea. Paul called Barnabas Barney. It was a little thing they had with each other. That boy went with us last time, and we got a few miles down the road, and he started missing Mama, and he went back home. And I just don't think we can go on this trip with a man we can't count on. Things could get difficult along the way, and what are we going to do this time when he turns tail and goes back home? The stage is set for a classic confrontation. How do you respond to one who has made a great failure in the ministry? Do you cast them aside and say they're not fit for this next trip, or do you try to restore them in ministry? It's a really great question. And if you're going to try to restore them in ministry, how long do they need to wait? How long do they need to prove themselves? How do you respond when somebody has made a big error? Well, true to form, Barnabas wants to give his cousin Mark the benefit of the doubt and give him another chance. But Paul was passionately opposed to bringing a quitter with them on this important, dangerous journey. One author described the opposing, well-intentioned mindsets that led to this great debate. He said, Paul looked at people and asked, what can they do for God's work? But Barnabas looked at people and said, what can God's work do for them? Both perspectives are important for the Lord's work, and sometimes it's difficult to keep those things in balance. If I were to stop everybody walking out of the building today and say, who was right, Paul or Barnabas? I suspect we probably have an even split of answers as people leave the building. They both had a very good point. This conflict between Paul and Barnabas was very different than the conflict we read about in the Jerusalem Council last week. That was kind of a broader church conflict over doctrinal issues, and this was a personal conflict between two brothers in Christ. I think what we find here is that the personal conflict is a lot harder to navigate than that bigger doctrinal conflict. The discussion escalates quickly into a debate, and then it becomes an argument. Luke says there arose a sharp disagreement so that they separated from each other. The word that is translated here as a sharp disagreement carries overtones of severely heightened emotions, red, distorted faces, loud voices, things being said that were better left unsaid. A very sorry sight. The Cotton Patch Gospel calls it a knockdown, drag-out fight. We can imagine what went on there. It's not a mild gentleman's disagreement, but an intense, passionate conflict. And it's ironic, I think, here that we find the son of encouragement losing his temper and the apostle Grace having very little of it to share with his friend in ministry. N.T. Wright says that when we read this passage the first time, that most of us want to take these two pig heads and just kind of knock them together and say, guys, you got to sort this out. You're the best team in the New Testament. You don't want to leave that behind. Get this worked out. Fix it. And we want to say that, and then even as we try to say that, we find ourselves saying instead, but by the grace of God, go I. Because we can easily imagine ourselves mired in this red-faced argument where both had a point and neither was willing to give. And eventually there was a great division. They can't resolve the issue, and so they agree to disagree, and they go their separate ways. Barnabas takes John Mark on a mission trip to Cyprus, and Paul, with the blessing of the church, takes Silas, and they go back on this journey that's going to be the second missionary journey of Paul that Luke is going to describe in detail. It's always interesting to me when reading through a story in the Bible to wrestle with the question of why this story is in the Bible. Luke has admitted to us that he's not telling us 100% of everything that happened in the early church. There are many things that he's omitting in the book of Acts. With an artful ease, he can kind of skate over months and even years with a phrase like, after some time. And we go back and look at it, we realize that there's a long period of time in there. There's a lot that he's not telling us, So with all that he's not telling us, why is he telling us this? If Luke had intended to give us a perfect impression of a perfect church, this story would have ended up on the editing room floor, quite certainly. He can go over months and years with a phrase like after some days, but here he chooses to zero in on a painful, awkward, difficult split between Paul and Barnabas. Luke could have found a much less embarrassing way of explaining how Paul and Barnabas went their separate ways, but he's not trying to tell us a perfect story about a perfect church. He's trying to tell us a very honest story about a very real church and very real servants of Christ's kingdom. He knows that we are imperfect people and that we are serving in an imperfect church, and he knows that in each generation this humbling and necessary lesson from this shocking little story will need to be heard, remembered, and taken to heart. This story jumps off these pages as a great warning to just how fragile fellowship and ministry partnerships are. Even the strongest fellowships and the strongest ministry partnerships are very fragile. We have to be ever so careful to check our egos at the door, or we are certainly going to be caught in some painful divisions from which we're not easily going to recover. It's an important warning for us to take to heart, but there's more than a warning here, because God took these imperfect men and he continued to use them even after this great division and conflict. God didn't cause their disagreement, but he somehow used it to advance both men in service to the kingdom. Fractured relationships are heartbreaking. Any of us who have ever lived through those kinds of experiences know how hard those are. But in God's hands of mercy, even a split in the fellowship can produce a positive outcome. In this case, we end up with 2 mission teams instead of 1. Twice the ground is covered somehow by the grace of God through this terrible season of conflict. Kent Hughes sees in this story a sign of gracious hope, that it is often through our difficulties and failures that God leads us to increased creativity and productivity. Somehow God often uses us in spite of us. Luke is showing us that the good news of Christ's church is a message that will not be silenced, even though the messengers are always imperfect and can't always get along. Somehow in these lines we find God's blessing even through this season of painful conflict between these 2 great brothers in Christ. The first church I pastored in Dublin was formed as a result of this kind of painful split. Community Baptist Church was established when a conflict at Park Street Baptist Church became untenable. The great joke is that that's how Baptists do church planting. We just get mad at each other and then we go and start a church somewhere else. We joke about it, but it's more real than most of us care to admit. Park Street had been characterized by kind of a fussing and fighting nature throughout its rocky history, and eventually that all boiled to a head under the leadership of one pastor who had split several churches before. The relationships there got so toxic that a good number of deacons and Sunday school teachers and church leaders kind of made a move to force the pastor to leave at a business meeting, and when that failed, they decided to leave the church themselves. And for several weeks, they met out under shade trees for worship and fellowship to kind of lick their wounds and figure out what to do next. They pulled their resources together, and they were able to rent a little facility in town where they had worship and fellowship, and they kind of planned strategy, and as they raised funds, they eventually bought almost a whole block in Dublin, several lots together. They were able to buy that land, and they eventually cleared it and built a fellowship hall with education space on that land, that property, and that's what the church looked like when we moved there. And while we were there during 5.5 years, we saw a good amount of of growth in that fellowship. We were able to work together and build a sanctuary. After we left and moved to Cotulla, they actually expanded the fellowship hall and doubled the size of it. God has really used that new church in many ways. Shortly after the church was splitting off and being founded, when they were moving forward from that time of painful conflict, they were able to acquire that land, those lots that were there together in town, and they were clearing off all the brush and trees and things in that property. And as they were doing that, they found all kinds of drug paraphernalia scattered all throughout that lot. Evidently, this property that they had acquired had been a safe haven for drug use and drug sales. And through their ministry there, God turned a safe haven for really negative activity in town into a house of worship and fellowship and service. And they took finding that drug paraphernalia as a sign that God wasn't done with them. They hadn't been founded under the best of circumstances, but somehow God was going to use them for His glory. I'm sure that God didn't cause that great disagreement at Park Street Baptist Church, and I'm sure God wasn't glorified by all the things that were said and done there. But somehow God took that heartbreaking story and He turned it into what is now known as the Miracle on Mesquite Street in Dublin, Texas. We're looking forward to visiting some of our friends there very soon. How does that kind of story happen? How does God take this painful split between Paul and Barnabas and turn it into the story of two mission teams going out with the gospel into the world? How does God take the terrible pain of conflict and disagreement in our lives and bless through it? How does God take a painful split and use it for the glory of His Son and the furthering of His kingdom? I don't know how God does those things, but I know that He does because I've seen them so many times. Paul and Barnabas' painful experience of conflict shows us that these two great servants of Christ's kingdom were far from perfect, but even in their imperfections, they had a lot to teach us. Their relationship fell apart, but ultimately it fell forward. They didn't leave the faith. They continued to live on mission for Jesus. They continued to serve the kingdom. They just did it in two different geographical directions. Today, I think it's so tragic when people get immersed in some kind of conflict in church and they fall away from the faith completely. It happens so often. I don't think people intend to do that, but so often children grow up apart from the faith. They grow up apart from the kingdom. They grow up apart from the love of fellowship among God's people because of some conflict mom and dad had with somebody in the church that they don't even know. Nobody really intends to do that, but that is such a regular occurrence. It's a terrible response. It's like saying, I'm so mad at the pastor. I'm so mad at the youth pastor. Let's focus on that. Let's be mad at the youth pastor instead. I'm so mad at my Sunday school teacher. I'm so mad at the chair of this committee. I'm so mad at whatever that I'm going to hurt my faith and I'm going to stifle the spiritual growth of my children. Now, I doubt that any of us would do that on purpose. But so often that's exactly how we respond to conflict. Paul and Barnabas refused to do that. They continued to live for the kingdom, going their separate ways, but living lives of service for Jesus. And God somehow blessed through that painful conflict by His grace, and the kingdom work was multiplied. This is a sad, tragic, and yet a hopeful story. Because even when the messengers fall short of the glory of God, the message continues. Not even our worst mess-ups can completely trip up the work of God's kingdom. Thanks be to God. Luke never resolves this conflict for us. It's kind of a frustrating thing that he does. Someday when we're in heaven, we'll have to get on to him about that. He leaves this kind of unsettled for us because I think really the issue is not, did Paul and Barnabas make up? How long did that take? How did it happen? The question is, how are we going to handle our times of conflict and our relational struggles? Are we going to opt for healing and the heavy lifting of reconciliation? Or are we going to take the coward's way out? Evidently, the church sided with Paul and supported his mission trip along with Silas, and we don't really know what became of this other team that went to Cyprus. Paul's letters give us some clues that bring us a great deal of hope as we wrestle through this story. In 2 different epistles, Paul later mentions Barnabas in very positive terms, giving us the idea that at some point the sting of this split had been soothed and this great friendship was somehow restored. Paul was even eventually reconciled to John Mark, and he mentions him as a co-worker in several of his later letters. From his Roman jail cell near the end of his life, the Apostle Paul wrote to his young protege Timothy, a character that we'll meet very soon in this story. And he said to him, "Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry." What a great conclusion. Apparently, John Mark seized the second chance that Barnabas gave him and made the most of it. And as we imagine Paul in his jail cell writing these encouraging words about Mark, we remember Barnabas the encourager, the one who was willing to give this kid a second chance when no one else was. And how Barnabas eventually redeemed him in ministry, even in the eyes of Paul. My friends, it is so important that we remember that we just don't see the full picture that God sees. Somehow God is writing a story of victory, joy, and blessing that cannot be thwarted by anything the world throws at us, that cannot even be thwarted by the mistakes we make in our own relationships. Now, as we reflect on this great story of God's blessing, even through painful conflict, let us ask together that God might shield our relationships and give us enough wisdom, grace, mercy, and wisdom and love to avoid letting the disagreements in our lives escalate beyond the reach of reconciliation. Let us pray that God might protect the unity of our own fellowship and the integrity of our shared mission. Let us make a commitment to fall forward if we're going to fall in ministry. Saying to each other, we may not always agree. We may not be able to sort through every disagreement, but one way or another, we will continue to serve the Lord as faithfully as we can. Maybe Paul and Barnabas' great split has encouraged you to overcome one. Maybe at some time in your story, someone in the church has wounded you in a way that you've never been willing or able to forgive. Maybe there's some relationship problem, some relational issue that you've been dealing with and stewing over, and it's never fully been resolved. Maybe today is the day to begin that process. Let the God who can even bless through painful conflict do a work of grace in your life. Let your life become a part of the story of restoration that God is writing in our midst. This morning, we're going to sing a song of invitation. And as we prepare to sing together, I want to extend an invitation to everyone who's here. Maybe today you're ready to give your heart and life to the Lord Jesus Christ. Maybe you've been teetering on the verge of faith for a long time, and for whatever reason, you've just decided today, this is the day. I've made a mess of my relationships on my own for long enough. Today is the day that I'm going to live the Jesus way from this day forth. You come this morning and make that commitment. It's a difficult walk. Sometimes it's a scary journey, but God travels with you every day. Jesus will never leave you nor forsake you. I invite you to come. Maybe today you're a believer, but there is some conflict, there's some unresolved issue, there's some struggle in your life that is keeping you from growing in faith, keeping you from serving fully, keeping you from moving forward. This morning, you just want to begin the process of praying through that and laying that down and getting to a place of forgiveness and reconciliation and restoration, whatever that looks like. You come this morning, we'll pray through that together. I'll pray for you where you're seated this morning, because I have no doubt that there's a lot of relational struggles represented in this room today. Maybe today you would come and make this your church home. And if you're thinking about doing that because we're really cool or our music is really good or the preaching's really good, I doubt that. But if you're thinking about that, don't do it. Because I guarantee you we will let you down. We are imperfect and flawed in so many ways, but somehow by God's grace, we are used in this community beyond ourselves. And if you want to be a part of that, I invite you to come. You respond to the Spirit however He leads your heart as we stand and we sing together.